This budget is a reflection on the government that delivered it. Out of touch, out of ideas and out of time. And never has so much been spent to achieve so little. No answers, no urgency and no leadership. Rents are out of control and you have done nothing. 1 million people are on waiting lists and no real step change. Energy prices are spiralling and your plan is to increase them further with carbon taxes. Budget 2020 should have responded to the major challenges we face as a society. Challenge in housing, challenge in healthcare, challenges in the cost of living crisis. It should have responded to the crisis in housing. It shouldn't be ever normal or tolerated that we are now facing average rents in this state of €1,350, or if you live in this capital city, that the average rent is €1,800 per month. It should never be accepted or normalised that students are having to couch surf, they're having to defer entry to college places, they're queuing up for food banks in Cork, for God's sake, and all of this is down to the pressure on prices and accommodation and the sky-high rents that they are faced with. It should have responded to the challenges facing patients and the staff who work in our health service, with more than 900,000 people on waiting lists, including nearly 100,000 children. And it should have responded appropriately to the cost of living crisis, with parents facing childcare fees that are amounting to a second mortgage and households facing rising energy bills. Budget 2022 should have been a budget with vision, a budget that was targeted, a budget for change, so that if you were a renter or if you were a young couple that was setting out to purchase your first home, or if you were a parent that was struggling with the cost of childcare, or if you were just a family struggling with the cost of energy prices, we should have heard a minister that stood up today and said, "We heard you, we hear you, and we're responding back." But that is not what we heard today. We heard more of the same. It needed to be a budget for change. And it reflects a government, as I said, that's out of touch and that is out of ideas. I'll follow and evaluate some of the specific measures in the budget, but first I want to also set out what could have been done, what should have been done and what would be done if Sinn Féin were in government. Bigay le budget fihe do frigra horch na priwglan at a ro marchauhi. Na dúchlan ye tihiachta is slainte gus secoris maralta at a gardu. Bigay le sin realta shaw frigra a horch at an dúchlan at a rev chili agus rev ebrani. Bigay frigra a horch at an gearchem tihiachta. Bigay frigra a horch at an dúchlan at a rov na har at ag bre an foran a obran san choras slainte. Agus bhí gae frigar hortir an costas maralta at a gardu a ríist is a ríiste eile. Bhí gae go mé an budget fihe dá, mar budget le tiiscint agus budget ar son na herau. Mas rud é gur císiú a bhí na la clán at a geri an ciad teachacheanart, na tuismar ag strachailt la costa sí, Erd Kurimliani na Chili at ag strahal la price ni foniv at ag gardu. Jeda go mé muinine gur ahanyan budget shaw an dúchlan at a road agus gur rigger an budget shaw is cen de chiel a yosu agus seal de chaili na de liani. Bigay go mé an budget shaw budget ar son na heria. Ta aspa all vian leis an budget. Chip doling lektish an scale na dúchlan at a road. Shaw realtas a mahurimse at a gan kiel, gan smuiche agus at a good am isti. This budget, Yaskin Corlia, is an opportunity not just to look forward to the year ahead, but also to look back on the year that has been. And I want to acknowledge the hardship that so many have felt over the past year and year and a half, whether as a result of bereavement, of isolation or job loss. And to pay tribute in particular to our healthcare professionals, our carers, our essential workers, all of those whom without we as a country could not have come through this pandemic. I want to also recognise the role and the efforts of our public service workers who, through introductions such as the measures of rolling out the pandemic unemployment payment and the wage subsidy scheme, demonstrated that at times that this state can innovate and respond back to the needs of our citizens. We can only learn from this experience, but know that when great reforms and innovations are required, the state can deliver. It is a warning to the cynics who tell us that nothing can change. They can, and for the better. We face many challenges as a society, but we also face opportunities. Noise and distraction from the British Government shouldn't deter us from finding practical solutions to ensure that the protocol can work effectively and smoothly. And I welcome allocations in the Brexit Adjustment Reserve Fund that will help mitigate the impact of Brexit. We should build on the growth of North-South trade to develop our all-Ireland economy and to benefit all of the citizens and regions. A crucial task as we begin the great project of national unity and reconciliation. We face great changes in the international tax landscape, now with 136 countries and jurisdictions signing up to the OECD agreement to ensure that multinationals pay their fair share in a globalised and digital age. Under this agreement, our economy can remain competitive, but only if we invest in those areas that are just as crucial for onward investment and job creation as our tax code is. In housing, in childcare, in infrastructure, in research, in education and skills. And we face, last and quarterly, the great challenges of climate change, which also brings opportunities to create new and well-paying jobs while improving the quality of life for all of our people. We can meet all of these challenges, but it will require ambition and it requires the right choices. The pandemic exposed weaknesses in our society, in our public services and in our economy. During the general election of 2020, people voted for change, and that desire for change was only strengthened during the pandemic. And it is through budgets that government paved the way for change or consolidate the status quo. That is the measure against which we will assess this budget. Workers and families have been for some time dealing with the rising cost of living, with unaffordable childcare costs, rip-off rents or mortgage repayments, and the cost of basic goods and services remaining stubbornly high. The cost of living squeeze is set to continue, with a further surge in gas and electricity prices expected in the weeks and months ahead. And it is now expected that the average household will see energy bills rise by €400 and €500 over the next 12 months. And we know that this is going to hit poor households hardest. So given this prospect, what does the government do? The government decides in its wisdom to increase energy prices further. That is simply wrong. Anybody will tell you that. It is wrong for the government to plough ahead with another increase in carbon taxes as people are seeing an increase in energy prices and fuel prices. An increase that will put additional financial pressure on households already struggling with utility and home heating bills. An increase in the carbon tax, let me say this clearly, won't provide a single alternative fuel source or means of travel for already pressed households. It is a con job. That's what it is, and that's the reality. Over the past 12 months, you have increased these costs twice. So according to the CSO, home heating oil increased by 40% in the last year. According to the AA survey, the price of petrol and diesel increased by 25% last year. But over that 12-month period, you have decided in your wisdom to increase the fill of an oil tank by €40. Every time we fill our petrol or diesel tank, it's another €3, and every time we buy a bag of coal, it's €2. It is a con job. It is about penalising and not incentivising, and Sinn Féin would not increase the carbon tax at a time when workers and families face an income squeeze and energy prices hikes in the time ahead. This government claims to have responded to the rise in energy prices by increasing the rate of fuel allowance and expanding the threshold. Of course, you aren't telling the full story. In reality, not even nearly anywhere we see the number of people who should be getting the fuel allowance, that it's only a small number of people who are actually getting them. You've allocated just €3.4 million in this budget to expand eligibility, and the government aren't doing enough. We have shown in our alternative budget how we would have allocated nearly 10 times that amount, with €30 million in expansion. Indeed, the government's measures are a poor compensation for their own carbon tax increases, not the wider increase in energy prices. So, as I said, Minister, it is a con job. You're taking with one hand and giving with the other. And the reality is, as I said here last year, when you increase this tax, all you're going to do is make families poorer. All you're going to do is push up the prices for people in rural communities to get around. And it's not about dealing with the issues of climate change that are real and have to be tackled in a head-on manner. A Sinn Féin government would also have established a utility debt fund to help many families who, as we know, are locked out of the fuel allowance. but also struggle with the cost of rising utility costs. And crucially, what we would have done and what you should have done is you should have increased all social welfare rates, core social welfare rates, by €10, but unfortunately, once again, the government hasn't adopted these proposals. As a result of the pandemic and public health restrictions, tens of thousands of people became unemployed overnight, and they saw their incomes plummet. Immediately, the pandemic unemployment payment was introduced and a rate set of €350. And this alone showed us that the basic rate of €203 was not enough to get by on for so many people at that point when they rely on our social protection system. And even before the pandemic, energy and child poverty were among the greatest challenges that we face as a society. A recent report by Social Justice Ireland found that 190,000 children currently experience poverty, with 630 of our citizens living below the poverty line. Now, we have to change that. Yet we tolerate a social protection system where each and every payment is below the poverty line. And the budget today that our ministers announced will continue that scenario. Sinn Féin has long called for an end to the political football that surrounds social welfare rates during the budget season by bringing forward social welfare rates that are above the poverty line and towards the minimal essential standard of living. This budget could and should have started that work. A Sinn Féin government would have increased working age payments by €10 as a first step in the path of reform and to revitalise our social safety net for workers and families. The government, we regret, has taken a very different approach. It is important to put all of this in context, given core social welfare rates have seen no increase since March 2019, despite the rising cost of living and recent energy hikes. Instead, the government have increased core social welfare rates by a fiver, an increase that doesn't even keep up with the 3% rise in prices over the last 12 months. Earlier this year, we had a report from the European Disability Forum, and they found that 38% of people with disability in the state are at risk of poverty or social exclusion. We need to protect and support our citizens with disability and ensure that they can not only get by, but that they thrive. And Sinn Féin would have furthered that objective by increasing the disability allowance and the blind pension by €10. And again, I regret that the government didn't follow our lead and implement that proposal. While we welcome the €5 increase in the state pension, something that Sinn Féin has called for, this government is committed to increasing the pension age, forcing those who have worked all their lives to work longer into the future. And while there's no measure in this budget to restrict the generous tax reliefs that are there for gold-plated pensions. But let me be clear, and Minister, I'll put you on notice in relation to this here. Sinn Féin will oppose tooth and nail any attempt that you have to increase the state pension age, and we will defend workers' rights to retire at the age of 65 with access to a pension. The government claimed to have responded to the cost of living with the tax package that they say would ease the burden on households. But let's drill into the details. The government have decided to increase the standard rate band by €1,500 at a cost of more than €300 million. This is a tax measure that excludes 80% of income earners. 8 out of 10 people do not benefit from this measure that costs the Irish taxpayers over €300 million. That's 2 million people that will not benefit from this, because this measure is designed at those that are on the higher earners. Yes, people like yourself, Minister, will benefit and many others will benefit, but in reality, do you really need an extra €400 in your back pocket? Again, this is not a targeted measure. It is a bad use of resources at a time of crisis in so many other areas. The reality is a worker, according to your tax package, will see about €2 a week in their pocket as a result of this, while those in the higher end, as I said, like yourself, will receive over €400 a year. It is not good for use of resources, and it means nothing in reality to somebody who is paying, as I said, €1,800 in rent in the city or €1,300 in other places across the state, or for that family who's paying €800 in childcare fees. You could have used that, and you could have been targeted, and you could have reduced the cost of living for those people that are hardest impacted by it. The government claims the tax package is designed to protect households against rising inflation, but renters will be scratching their heads at that claim. The government introduced a tax package that will protect the highest income earners against rising inflation, but at the same time, you've brought in legislation that allows landlords to increase rents with inflation. And we know that rents have risen by an average of 7% across the state, with the average rent in Dublin now standing at €1,800. And we as Sinn Féin have called for a ban on rent increase over the next 3 years. But beyond that, we want real relief for renters. 300,000 people that are seeing their rents go up every single year, and we wanted to make sure that they would have money back into their pocket, up to €1,500 by a refundable tax credit. Now, why and under God did this government collectively just decide to ignore the hardship that renters face? Are you not aware of what's going on? Do you not understand the pressure, the anxiety that families are facing every single week trying to make ends meet in this regard? No challenge threatens the living standards of our citizens more than the housing crisis. The housing policy over the past decade has failed under Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil. A dependence on private developers and on institutional investors to deliver supply hasn't worked for those renting or indeed those trying to buy a home. I think nearly everybody accepts that now, bar the government. Although who it did serve, and even the millionaires are telling you that now, is it served the big developers, it served the landlords, it served the institutional investors. Over the past decades, rent prices have increased. Over the past decade, rent prices have increased by 2/3, while house prices continue to rapid climb towards the height that they were during the Celtic Tiger madness. And who's the victims in all of this? It's ordinary workers and it's ordinary families. But a dysfunctional housing market can be fixed, and the Irish people need to know that. They need to have hope that there is solutions there. Sinn Féin, like the ESRI, have proposed doubling the state investment in social and genuinely affordable housing for rent and purchase. We have shown what could be done and what should be done. 20,000 social and affordable homes in 2022 and the years following. This level of ambition is not aspirational. It is absolutely necessary if we are to meet the needs of citizens and avoid future hardship. For several years, we've been calling for an end to the scourge of dereliction and of vacancy through the introduction of a vacant property tax in order to put vacant homes into use for workers and families who need affordable accommodation. We have for years called for an end to the lucrative tax breaks and incentives that have not only facilitated but encouraged bulk buying of homes by investment funds that lock aspiring buyers out of home ownership and are driving up rents for everybody else. But you've ignored that again. The government instead provided exemptions and you provided loopholes that has kept this in place today, ensuring that home buyers and renters continue to be at a disadvantage to property investors where their only interest is profit and price hikes. No tax for them, but by God, if you're trying to keep your family warm this winter, then there's a tax hike for you. And that's the priorities of this government. The policies we have provide real solutions to deliver the housing needs for our citizens, increasing the supply of affordable homes and cutting rents. But the government refused to bend, allowing property investors to run riot all the while. In this budget, you've continued with demand-side measures, such as the shared equity scheme, that pour more fuel on the fire by locking in unaffordable house prices and rents, propping up the economic position of landlords and developers during this time. And this is the sixth housing budget of Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil and underpins Minister Darragh O'Brien's new housing plan, a plan that is an extension, not a departure, of the previous plans of government, a dysfunctional housing system that is in crisis. We in Sinn Féin have brought forward proposals over and over again to provide relief for renters and affordable supply for home buyers. And everyone accepts we need a fundamental change in our housing policy. As I said, everybody bar the government. And today's housing budget is hugely disappointing. There is only 420 additional million in capital funding for housing. A Sinn Féin government called for double the investment. That's €1.6 billion additional. That's what the ESRI was calling for, 4 times what you have provided in additionality, delivering 20,000 social and affordable houses. That's the urgency. That's what's needed. If you really believe there's an emergency there, then you need to step up to the plate and you need to deliver. But you didn't do that today. The government continues with the same unambitious budgets of the past. It subsidised landlords and developers with absolutely nothing, zero, nada, for renters in this budget. Now, you've introduced a zoned land tax. You're not going to introduce it for another, you've announced it, but you're not going to introduce it for another 2 years. Like, seriously, do you not get the urgency here? But even worse than that, worse than even the delay that it's not going to be there for 2 years, you introduce it at a rate of 3%, and you get rid of the 7% levy that's on the same land. You couldn't make this up, Minister. Again, a sneaky little policy that actually benefits those with land that aren't being in productive use. And indeed, the cost of land, the cost of those sites are increasing by more than 3% per year. So there's no disincentive for them to just sit and do nothing. Again, it shows a government that are out of ideas, out of ambition, lacking the will to deal with this, and seriously, you are out of time on this issue. And I think the public have moved way beyond you because they know that this government can't fix the housing crisis. There is nothing new or set in stone to deal with the issue of vacant homes. There's only 60 million for redress for those families and homeowners who are victim of Mica and Pirate scandal, and nothing for the fire safety to fix. Now, the Minister, he didn't mention it in his speech, but it's in his book, 20 million extra. That brings it up to 40 for the defective concrete block. That is an insult, Minister. I marched and proudly did as a person from Donegal, but I wasn't alone. There were thousands of us, right from across the state, who know the right thing has to be done by those homeowners who are in those homes because of the light touch and no regulation when you were in government. This is the Fianna Fáil era that is crumbling round their heads, and you announced today an extra 20 million. That's an insult, and you need to rectify that very, very quickly and bring reprieve to those families and say that there will be 100% redress and families will not be waiting for long times into the future. And you need to make an appropriate allocation, which we have argued should be 200 million next year, not the 20 million that you have proposed as an increase. This budget is a disappointment for renters who have provided, and they are being provided with no relief and no answers. It is a disappointment for aspiring homebuyers who, in the light of the measures announced by the government and adopted by the government, face another year of rising house prices and a lack of affordable supply. But our message in Sinn Féin is clear. The housing crisis can be fixed, but only with a government with ideas and the will to deliver, regardless of the opposition from vested interests who are served by the status quo and who are served by this government. As so many struggle to secure a mortgage for their first home, others struggle with the cost of childcare. And there's a clear difference between Sinn Féin and the government when it comes to this issue. The government parties have faith in the private market and the profit motive to deliver goods and services that we in Sinn Féin believe are best delivered as a public service. Families are being fleeced by the cost of childcare. The average full-time fees stand at €750 per month. Childcare costs here are the most expensive in Europe, with a recent UNICEF report saying that childcare here is among the least affordable in the developed world. In the developed world, Minister. That's on your shoulders. You know this, because this isn't by accident, it is because of a direct result of government policy. This government invests less in childcare than anywhere else in the developed world. As a result, many families are crippled with childcare costs, with many parents who would like to work forced to stay at home. For others, they face more fundamental choices, such as whether they can even afford to start a family. And this is a real and damaging consequences for children, for parents, and indeed for our economy. A dysfunctional childcare sector where fees are too high, wages are too low, and not enough places exist. So Sinn Féin has called for a new model of childcare provision, one that can be delivered, one that is delivered and operational in other countries right across Europe. A Sinn Féin government would establish a public childcare and early years service, making an investment to deliver accessible and affordable childcare for parents. We would do this by assuming the wage bill and additional overheads of the sector, while at the same time reducing fees. This new direction in childcare provision could have started and should have started next year. You could have stood here and adopted our policy, and we would give it to you, and we'd be glad of it if you announced it, which would slash fees by a third in 2022 and by another third in 2023. But what have you done? Instead of grasping that challenge and moving forward with bold reforms, the government have stolen our policies and you have made a dog's dinner of them. That's the reality of it. It's ridiculous. Instead of bringing forward a plan to significantly reduce childcare fees for families hit the hardest, families with children under the age of 3, you've brought forward measures that locks in these unaffordable levels of fees. This is crazy stuff. This is one of the biggest pressures on people at this point in time, and you haven't reduced those fees by a single euro. And that's again a demonstration of the lack of targeted approach in relation to this government. Minister, if you haven't heard it from parents, then let me tell you, childcare fees need to be reduced, Minister, not locked in, right? Minister, you've decided in this budget to reduce the banking levy by €63 million. I note that in your written speech you had a different set of words where you talked about excluding Ulster Bank and others, but you're reducing it by €63 million, despite the fact that the taxpayer is still on the hook for a lot of this money. €64 billion that was ploughed into the sector to bail these banks out a decade ago. I simply, I would say I can't understand this measure, but again, you're a minister who again decides that they don't have to pay any tax on their profits for the next couple of decades, so therefore it shouldn't be surprising that you're reducing the banking levy. Sinn Féin would have extended it, and we would ensure that the banks continue to pay €150 million to the Exchequer next year and the years beyond. I do welcome the budget measure to reduce public transport costs for 19 to 23-year-olds by 50%, an approach that's been advocated by Sinn Féin, including proposals to provide free fares for all under 18s. It's obvious that the Minister was reading our alternative budget, because last week he was saying that we shouldn't do this, that we needed to increase capacity. However, this measure does need to coincide with increased capacity for it to be effective, something I and my party will scrutinise in the budget. We welcome the decision to relax the mean test for carers allowance. This is something that Sinn Féin and carers campaigned for, but the government hasn't gone far enough in this measure. They have postponed the move until June and allocated just €10 million for the purpose. Sinn Féin government, if we were in government, we would have opened the payment to many, many more carers, allocating €50 million, further addressing an inheritance issue and introducing a crucial issue, that is a pension for long-term carers. Our Health Service Minister has gone through 18 months of unprecedented crisis and challenge, and I want to, on behalf of my party, acknowledge the heroic efforts and dedication of healthcare staff who have gone above and beyond to keep our patients safe and to keep our country safe. Despite their heroic efforts, the widespread support of the public and this Dáil, there is nothing in this budget to deliver fair pay or allowances for student nurses. That's disgraceful. That is absolutely disgraceful. Again, I can't believe that you haven't responded to that issue. Every day our healthcare staff have pushed through long hours and they've saved lives. They've done so despite our badly managed and underfunded healthcare system. They, like their parents, deserve a budget that responded back by increasing capacity, reducing waiting lists and putting a plan in place to improve conditions and care outcomes for staff and patients. They now face the prospect of a fast-approaching winter and are not convinced that the government has the appropriate resources and planning in place. There are already more than 450 people on trolleys statewide, with emergency departments overflowing and understaffed. There are now 900,000 people on hospital waiting lists, nearly 100,000 of those are children. And this budget should have met that scale. You should have met that challenge that are faced by those in our hospital, by the staff and by the patients. But it's again reliant on outsourcing to the private sector, to agencies in private hospital. The government health measures are disappointing, to say the least. They won't deliver any new acute hospital beds above pre-committed levels and only 19 ICU beds to be delivered next year. It fails to respond to the difficulties faced by patients and staff in our hospital. We called for funding to deliver 600 additional new public beds and 34 additional ICU beds. That's the ambition, that's the energy, that's the determination that was needed, that should have been delivered. The government, you'll blame COVID-19, but that's only part of the story, and we know that. Waiting lists have been increasing for unacceptable levels for a number of years. What we needed was an unprecedented level of investment that was targeted in more hospital beds, targeted in staffing levels, theatre capacity and diagnostics. We needed a phase change, we needed a new direction, and we needed to see commitment to building an Irish National Health Service. Trust in the government's commitment in that regard in terms of universal healthcare is at an all-time low. Childcare, which was to be the roadmap for universal healthcare at the point of need, called for the rolling out of free GP care by 2022 for everyone in the state, by 2022, by next year. Today, the government have provided to extend GP care for 6-year-olds and 7-year-olds. Is it no wonder that every Tom, Dick and Harry is jumping ship from the Sláinte Implementation Advisory Council, and it's difficult to blame them? What you should have done is invested properly in targeted measures, boosting hospital capacity, delivering an additional 4,000 acute beds by 2028, starting with 600 to be funded next year. We recognise that investing in community services is essential to making healthcare work better, to cut waiting times, and we would have invested $200 million on improving the accessibility of primary and community services. Can I just finally say, as I'm running out of time, $24 million for mental health? This is one of the biggest crises. Additional, $24 million in additional on mental health, one of the biggest crises that are facing young and old in this state. And the lockdown and the pandemic has a huge, and that again is an insult that needs to be revisited by this government. What needed to be done, as we showed you, is ramping up investment and additional investment in mental health by €110 million. Child and adolescent mental health and primary mental health care services, expanding counselling to universal coverage and investing in dual diagnosis. Look, Minister, this is the 13th time that I've responded to the budgets, and each time there are different needs in society. But I really say this to you. Your budget has failed to recognise the crisis in housing, has failed to recognise the pressure that people are on and renters, because there's nothing there. You have locked in unaffordable prices at childcare when you could have done something completely different. And in terms of increasing petrol and fuel costs and home heating time at a time of rising energy costs, it just baffles me. This is a government that's out of touch. Clearly, you are out of ideas. We're willing to give you the ideas, or better off, maybe you should leave the job to us.
Politics is about choices, and rarely is that clearer than on budget day. A government's budget is a fiscal expression of its policy priorities. So, does it tackle sky-high rents? Does it tackle unaffordable childcare? Does it tackle a health system bursting at its seams? And no, Ministers in Taoiseach, no, it does not. The crises we face in each of these areas didn't come about through some act of God. They were the direct result of political decisions made by the men seated across from me in this chamber and by their Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and Green Party predecessors. A budget delivers on a government's priorities and the interests it serves. So does it deliver for the young worker trying to pay extortionate rents on a meagre wage, the family desperately trying to pay their childcare fees, the couple living in their parents' box room, waiting for their lives to start while they scrimp and save and watch in despair as house prices inflate beyond reach, the elderly woman living alone and trying to heat her home while anxiously watching the energy bills go up and up, the man lying in agony on a trolley in a hospital corridor while exhausted nurses tell him they're sorry, but he still can't be seen, the 65-year-old who has worked all her life and wants to retire, but is forced to keep working long, tiring shifts on her feet all day. I can't remember a Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael-led government ever delivering on affordable housing, accessible childcare, a fair day's pay for a day's work, a national health system, or indeed a sustainable environment. For too long, this government's priorities have been the priorities of the well-heeled special interests, the vested interests who pull the strings, the vulture funds whose interests are served by ever-increasing rents, the large private developers whose interests are served by ever-increasing property prices, the private health insurance industry whose interest is served by stymieing the rollout of a national health system, the data centre lobby whose interests are served by generous capital allowances which allow them to write off much of their construction costs while the cost of heating our homes increases. They are the insiders who are always taken care of by this government, while ordinary families and workers are pushed to the back of the queue. So let's be clear. The crises we are facing in all of these areas are a direct result of government policy. But the good news is that what has been done by the government can be undone. It can be undone by a very different type of government, one with a very different set of policy priorities, a government which delivers for communities, for families and for workers, which puts ordinary people first and stands up for them, a government for change. We, on this side of the House, in Sinn Féin, stand ready to form such a government. Until we have a government that is prepared to do just that, then politics in this state will merely be the shadow cast upon society by big business. Ari bín ráhannaí le déana agaí chuile lá beo sa teach seo ag míon tionchar nach beag ar riine. Tá rá agaí seasa le gnáthaileí agus leis an goshaintear. Le daoine atá híos ag costasí marachtála, lob siúd atá ag iad cíosnaí róordas na caracha, nó nach bhfuil an na tálaí óhmhóra go chóram leanaí a chlúdach. Le muintear na tútha, a bhín fácaí ar an trá go mion minic marall ar aspa servicí, aspa infrastruchtúr agus aspa deisna fosíochta. Nu mar tá déanta ag rialtas a níor rialtas hána is féidir líb seasa leis na bancéirí, na créachchiistí agus na ferbróirí móra. Is mór an trúr go hochra sibh clí leis an tean folitiíocht agus gan tóirt faoin na géirchéime na éagsúla tá geilint ar an bobal. Ach tá bailach eile ann, tá slí le sochaí níos cothramí a chinsiú dar bobbal, agus tá muide sás na háirithe sin a chur a bhain, agus bhah rialtas faoi stúr Sinn Féin in ná stíl na políochta sa stáit a ahrú ó bhain. This year is the 10th anniversary of Fine Gael entering government, so cohordiachas leab. Not only that, it's the 6th housing budget jointly delivered by Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, so cohordiachas leab birch. Somehow, you've managed to push house prices back towards 2007 levels and out of the reach of many. The highest rents in Europe. You've also presided over the largest increase in homelessness in the history of this state. And not only that, but you've helped to create new situations which put people at risk of homelessness. And I'm talking about the workers whose wages haven't kept up with the rents. I'm talking about students who can't find somewhere to stay. I'm talking about pensioners on fixed incomes whose landlord is selling up and they can't find somewhere they can afford. This economic insecurity has bred misery for many, and misery breeds anxiety and mental health changes. The housing crisis and the mental health crisis are joined at the hip, and there's no mystery about how this happened. This was not an act of God or the subject of some strange forces. It was the deliberate result of the government policy, your policy. You fashioned a housing model which rests on 3 pillars: vulture funds, large private developers and taxpayer subsidies for both. These vulture funds were welcomed with open arms. And Minister Michael Noonan, your predecessor minister, said that they played an important role in the ecology by cleaning up dead animals. Dead animals. Is that your view on workers, pensioners and families? Because for many, that's clearly how it feels. The chief executive, indeed, of one large vulture fund said that rent increases were so dramatic that he truly felt bad for the Irish people. Criticism of your policy has come from across the spectrum. It's actually come from across the world, and I think to your great embarrassment, even the UN has criticised your favourable treatment of them. And when there's a public outcry, what do? You take an idea that we put forward last year to stop them bulk buying homes, but then provide exemptions so long as the properties are leased back to local authorities at crazy cost to taxpayers. But of course, again, a great deal for them. So while Fine Gael helps with the rents, Fianna Fáil helps with the prices, and meanwhile the Green Party quite literally falls asleep at the wheel. Minister O'Brien's much-hyped shared equity scheme will further push up prices, as my colleague Owen O'Brien has pointed out. But if it's such a good idea, where did this scheme come from? Because I didn't read in any of your general election manifestos. But here's a clue. The 2 big property lobby groups, one of whom happens to be a former leading Fianna Fáiler, both published shared equity scheme proposals. And then suddenly, the light bulb goes off in Minister O'Brien's head. Yes, he's just actually had an idea for a shared equity loan scheme. I mean, honestly, who do you think you're kidding? And the measures that have been put to us here today are no radical departure, not the radical departure that we need. Are they a break from the failed model? Well, a lot of numbers have certainly been bandied out, and every year in Budget Day I think it's quite interesting. We hear these big numbers being bandied out, and I think to a lot of people it might seem impressive. But what we need to point out is that a significant part of the increase has arisen from capital carryover. The capital carryover is massive, and that's money that was previously available to Minister O'Brien, but which he was unable to spend. So that, in effect, isn't new money. You've outlined €468 million extra for social housing, but I wonder how much of that will be capital carryover. Your actual increase in capital spending for housing is around €420 million, in comparison to our own proposed additional capital spend of €1.6 billion on housing. So you are well short of what the likes of the ESRI were calling for. The next thing we need to do is separate what the Minister is proposing will be built for affordable and social and what's just another developer subsidy scheme, because these things work in very different ways. The building of social and affordable housing is how we tackle this crisis. These developer-led subsidy schemes at best lock in high prices and at worst push them up even higher. The schemes are the Shared Equity Scheme, Help to Buy and the new Cree Cónaithe. And when we look at this, it is clear that you are providing more funding for developers than people trying to gain access to affordable housing. And both of you mentioned that housing was a crisis of the time, but little is done. We would end the tax breaks for the vulture funds and the developers, deliver genuinely affordable homes to buy for ordinary people. We would ban rent increases and put a month's rent back in people's pockets. We would deliver a functioning vacant site levy immediately and not in a few years' time, and not delay it, allowing more land banking and price increases. Successive Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael governments have commercialised, commodified and financialised what should be a very obvious public good. They have turned housing from something which families and workers can call home into something completely different. They've turned it into an asset of speculation for large investment funds, something concerned with the rental yield on asset, on capital appreciation on dividends for shareholders. What kind of gross distortion is this, that you have allowed to try and normalise something so frighteningly abnormal? This pandemic has exposed the cracks in our health as well as in our housing system, but it absolutely exposed and exacerbated the cracks in our health system, but it didn't cause them. The causes well predated the onset of COVID-19. They were present when Leo Varadkar was Minister for Health. They were present when Simon Harris was Minister for Health, and Taoiseach, they were even present when you were Minister for Health. And today we have over 900,000 people languishing on waiting lists, and almost 100,000 of them are children. And that is simply outrageous. And we would have all heard stories about children especially who are languishing on these waiting lists, and we heard it this morning on the Claire Byrne show, children like Adam. And these children have been let down time and time again by glossy budget launches which provide photo opportunities and praise for ministers but do nothing for ordinary people who are utterly failed by our healthcare system. Now, yesterday we had 477 people on trolleys in our hospitals. And according to the INMO, this was the highest number of patients on trolleys since the onset of the pandemic. So while last year, I recall ye shouting loudly about all the additional capacity ye were going to provide the sector, nothing has changed. Nothing has changed for ordinary people. So, Ministers, let's be clear. As things reopen, so do the old wounds in our health system. The results of the failure to ensure that there are enough doctors, enough nurses and enough beds. What we need to do is build capacity in our health system. What we need to do is build a national health system which finally puts an end to the two-tier health approach. One which can deliver affordable, accessible health and social care. And this government's budget will not go nearly far enough to address this crisis. You're proposing free GP childcare for the under-8s, but as my colleague said, I mean, we were expecting universal free GP care by next year, so unfortunately I'm not going to be able to hold my breath on that one. But other than a few additional ICU beds, there's no additional acute or community care beds of over and above what was provided last year, and only 311 million for new measures. And yet we have rising waiting lists, crises in our emergency departments and trolley counts rising. There is no vision or no delivery to make healthcare work. And no additional acute or community beds on top of what was funded. And only $250 million to tackle waiting lists, which is just simply the same old, same old. A Sinn Féin government would deliver 932 additional beds, comprised of inpatient beds, critical care beds, neurorehabilitation beds and special community beds for mental health. We'd expand theatre capacity, modernise our e-health system and upgrade and replace equipment. We would also deliver fair pay and allowances for student nurses and midwives. And now this Dáil voted on a motion which you didn't oppose, but the fact that you've done nothing here is absolutely shocking. The pandemic has had many physical tolls on our society and on our healthcare, but it has also had a significant impact on the mental health of many, many of our citizens. We have finally, as a society, become more open about mental health struggles, and it's now time for major investment in this area. If Sinn Féin were in government, we would today launch the biggest mental health budget in the history of the state. You have outlined an additional spend on mental health of $24 million. We would provide $140 million in additional funding for mental health. We know that there has been a rise in eating disorders since the onset of the pandemic. We need an adult eating disorder team in each CHO, and at the moment there is only the one in Dublin, and that's not good enough. And I hope you listen specifically in relation to that also. What our rural communities learned today is that this government has no plan, no vision, and no fiche for our family farms. We proposed almost €220 million that would provide for our suckler and sheep sectors that would support smaller and poorer farmers. What the government has delivered is an accounting exercise, a simple rollover, and no measures that will come close to meet the needs of a sector in crisis. Tackling the cost of living has I've heard it so many times from both of you ministers that tackling the cost of living has been an aim of yourselves and of your predecessors for a long time. But we've been hearing it so long that at this stage I genuinely think you're actually trolling us. Because this state regularly ranks as one of the most expensive places to live in the entire world. When it comes to actually addressing some of the most fundamental aspects of the costs of living, your measures already seem at best ineffective and at worst exacerbating the problem. And this government is basically telling us, look, I'm actually really sorry, but can't deal really with housing, can't really deal with healthcare, can't really deal with childcare, but look, there's a couple of quid, let's all forget about it and we'll move on with our lives. But that doesn't wash with people anymore, ministers. And if government can't tackle the big systemic crises that we face, then what in the name of God can it do? Take childcare, which is like a second mortgage for families. The current model has utterly failed families, early childhood educators and creche owners. You can tinker around the model all you like, but a failed model is a failed model. You are providing additional funding of €78 million. That's of course welcome. But by extending the universal subsidy to 15, you are going to freeze fee. But this is freezing fees at already inflated levels. That's not a reduction. This is a sector which has starved of funding for years. You've increased that funding, but it will not negate the fundamental changes this sector needs. You provided additional funding for wages, which is to be ring-fenced, and again, that is welcome. But no wage scale has been provided, so the staff will have to wait and see what kind of increase they will get. Now, I will look with interest at the detail in your announcement and what this will mean for this sector, because I am concerned that the devil will be in the detail. And while I want to welcome this element of the budget, it seems more like plans on paper. So many people, and particularly women ministers, are locked out of the workforce because of the unaffordability of childcare. We need to tackle that. And we have a vision for childcare, a vision that is backed up by a detailed plan, a plan that delivers for parents and those working in the sectors. And over the course of 2 budgets, we would cut the costs for parents by 2/3, because that is what is needed. And while many women, as I said, are locked out of the workplace as a result of childcare costs, many other families who are locked out of third-level education will look on with despair. Since Fine Gael came to power in 2011, you've implemented harsh cuts and commercialised this sector. So not only did you commercialise housing, you're also doing the same with this sector. You pushed an ever greater amount of the financial burden on students and parents by doubling fees. While funding levels have been rising incrementally since 2017, this has only barely covered the cost of additional student PACEs. You have again chosen to provide pre-allocated funding, which makes for good soundbites, rather than providing adequate core funding for higher education institutions needed to deliver for students and the wider society. Ministers, you have regularly talked about the need to catch up in primary and secondary education after the impact of COVID. But this budget will mean many GESH schools will still not have access to hot meals. No additional school completion, no homeschool liaison, nothing of any significance to help secondary schools, and an inadequate pupil-teacher ratio reduction. No educational psychologists, no movement on free books, despite it being a programme for government commitment. And our schools will remain underfunded because no increase in capitation of any scale, forcing schools to ask for voluntary contributions from parents and hungry children. If we are serious about tackling the climate crisis, then we need to take radical steps to reduce carbon consumption, and I think that's a fairly straightforward concept, but something I think isn't fully understood by this government. And I mean, we all know that we have a car culture in this state, but let's be frank, it's forced car ownership in many areas, and the two key issues are accessibility and affordability, and we absolutely need to get people on public transport, but how do we do that when the two key issues are accessibility and affordability? Last week, Minister Eamon Ryan suggested that fees wouldn't be reduced for a number of years, and today you have the announcement that you'll be halving the cost of fees for 19 to 23-year-olds. I welcome it as a first step, but it clearly doesn't go far enough or fast enough. We would deliver free public transport for under 18s, and we would do that over the course of two budgets. That's the kind of vision we need. We need to change the culture of the youngest generation, and that's where we would start. And it's imperative we incentivise the use of public transport to try and tackle transport emissions and install the habit from an early age. Then what about all the areas with no public transport available to them? And I'm thinking of those areas between Galway and Dublin where you just caught the number 20 expressway bus and you're telling the people of rural Ireland to get out of the car, but you're not willing to provide additional public transport, so what do you expect of them? Build it and they will come, ministers. You told us that carbon tax was to help us reach our climate targets and that this latest increase will see an increase of €40 to fill of oil. Yet you allowed over 70 data centres to be built, and the Taoiseach only recently called for the fast-tracking of more of them. So the average data centres, as we know, use the same amount of energy as a small city the size of Kilkenny. So you've allowed the energy equivalent of 70 Kilkennys to be built. It places incredible pressure on the energy grid, and it's ordinary people who have to pick up the cost in terms of rising energy prices. And when you hear about the energy price inflation, know this. The inflation has largely been imported. The overwhelming majority of data that these data centres hold is from other jurisdictions, and the reasons that they are here is because when these companies build these data centres, they can essentially write off much of the cost of construction through generous capital allowances, and that's why our budget wants to put a stop to these. Because the taxpayer is essentially subsidising the cost of construction, so they can use up huge amounts of energy, meaning higher energy costs and our carbon emissions targets pushed out further. The capital expenditure laid out, in this budget pales in comparison to what a Sinn Féin government would do. Not only do we believe this is appropriate, we think it's absolutely necessary to tackle the scale of the crisis in our public infrastructure, and that is by no means a niche view. We've had the IMF and the EU Commission both tell us in recent times that the poor state of our public infrastructure is an underlying weakness in our economy. And as has been outlined, we've signed up to the OECD process, which will see our corporation tax rate move to the 15% for companies with revenues above $750 million. And it was said that our 12.5% was seen as the cornerstone of our economy and a chief plank in our industrial strategy. So it should be clear that in order to remain competitive, we need to invest. And this competitiveness will have to be built on the strength, accessibility and affordability of our education system. It will be built on the skills, talent and hard work of our labour force. It will rest on how affordable, accessible and desirable a place to live this is. It will be dependent on the quality, connectivity and accessibility of our public infrastructure. All this requires investing for the future in our future. The scale of our capital expenditure needs to be commensurate with the scale of the challenges we face. We believe the government's budget fails on this. The housing crisis will continue to get worse. We will continue to see the construction of office buildings and hotels, and very little in terms of affordable and social homes. And that is why we have proposed the building of 20,000 affordable and social homes, because that is what is needed. And with regard to health, Childcare is foundering on the rocks with a lack of government follow-through. And we have over 900,000 people languishing on our waiting list, and we are calling for significant capital investment. And now is absolutely the right time to do it. Investment is something that can create an asset which can generate a return. Public investment creates public assets from which we can all benefit from. And it's time to invest in our people, and it's time to invest in.
Sorry, Taoiseach, it's quite difficult to hear. Sorry, it's quite difficult to hear with the chat. We've
been talking for the last few minutes.
It's quite difficult for me to hear. Don't mind the other. No. It's just.
Just be clear, my time has been eaten away here, so
it's quite difficult. Continue, Deputy. Continue.
My time has been eaten away there, so you might think of that in the last few seconds. Gurmagat the last can chorlia. I was basically one second. I actually gear a couple of other raw. Okay, he shook. So Arish Tonrega agus an Gaeltach Fáca inách na Lafina. €6.3 million agus gan €8 million. Awan go sin mar winu capital. Níl ein tagart go chosti cofsiachta a bhí gealta go cholostí saori Gaeltachta Tomwheel. Níl ein a chorú na cirithe a bhí curtha bhaimar ngéige agus an Gaeltacht leis na blianta nús nó scéimena agus agris ríhábhachtacha a thuirt ará scéim leirt na gaige Gael agris nú an Commission log anamacha. Níl fac sa bhreis gon Commissioner Changa in anón go bhfreigrachtaí breise ag anis faoin mille Changa. Agus go bonusach, níl ein rud an a thug an ahantas gon ggéirchéim atá an gon Gaeltacht nó gon dáintear tá ahananta ag sanolaí an rialtais go dúchach deara leis an ngéige mar hanga leabhartha sa Gaeltacht ribhéaran na deblion amachrún. Is mór an cudarsnacht idir an aspa óí an atá seo agus an €4 million de bhartas dearfacha multa ag mo chóglachaí agus ó snodí. Ari, we in Sinn Féin want to build a stronger, fairer and united Ireland. An Ireland that is a good place to live, a place that offers youth a future and old age a security. We have a new vision for Ireland. Tá fís nuan go éireann, tír láidir, féireailse agus aontaithe. But on this, the people are heady, ministers, like they've been on many constitutional issues in the past: divorce, marriage equality and a woman's right to choose. The conversation on a new Ireland has begun. It has begun in people's kitchens, in the local shops and the hairdressers, but we don't see you leading on this. So it's a case of lead, follow or don't stand in the way. We need a government that will prepare for Irish unity, a government that will seize the opportunity that unity brings to build a fairer Ireland. And we need you, ministers, to start these preparations. We need you to deliver a citizens' assembly which will be inclusive to all views and opinions, that will start an inclusive debate on the constitutional future of our island. And you should have made provision for this in today's budgets. You need to catch up, ministers. For this government, the golden rule is that he who has the gold makes the rules. It's time for a new government who follow the rule of the people, by the people, for the people, that delivers budgets which can deliver the transformative change that fix the societal problems we face, because this will that our political system is responsive and capable of responding to the needs of voters. Our budget puts workers and family first. It wants to invest in our people and public infrastructure. It wants to make housing a right, not an asset class. It wants to make healthcare accessible on the basis of public need, not private greed. Some of our critics like to dismiss our arguments. They say that we are unrealistic, and indeed they actually say that we are populist. But we shouldn't listen to the naysayers and the defenders of the status quo. These are the people who see things as they are and they ask why. But we are a party that are planning for things that never were, and we are asking why not. Ministers, change is coming. Your time is up.